Wyoming Territory, 1872. The silence was a language Caleb Hale had learned to speak fluently. It was the native tongue of the high plains, a vast and unforgiving lexicon written in wind that scoured the rock and sun that bleached the bone. His ranch was nestled in a shallow valley carved by a creek that ran clear and cold even in the driest summers, a vein of life in an otherwise austere landscape. The cottonwoods that lined its banks were the only sentinels he required, their leaves whispering secrets he no longer cared to understand. For 5 years, this silence had been his shield, his penance, and his only companion. He stood on the porch of the small cabin he had built with his own hands, the raw pine weathered to a silver gray, solid as his own resolve. The morning air was sharp, carrying the scent of sagebrush and damp earth. Below him, his small herd of cattle moved like a slow, brown river across the sparse grasslands. He had just enough to be self-sufficient, just enough to keep his hands busy and his mind from wandering down paths that ended in unmarked graves. His world was a careful construction of routine and isolation, a fortress built stone by heavy stone against the intrusion of memory. A hawk circled high overhead, a dark speck against the immense, pale blue of the sky. It saw everything: the slow turn of the windmill, the shimmer of heat already rising from the plains, the solitary figure of a man who had intentionally made himself small in a land that was anything but. Caleb's gaze followed the bird, a flicker of something that might have been envy in his cool gray eyes. To be that free, that unburdened by the gravity of loss. But his feet were firmly on the ground, rooted in the soil that held his past. Sometimes, if he let his guard down in the quiet of the evening, he could almost feel the phantom weight of a small hand in his, or hear the echo of a woman's laughter, soft as the rustle of autumn leaves. He would quickly push it away, the pain of familiar, hot poker against his heart. Attachments were anchors, and anchors could drown a man. He had learned that lesson with a finality that had shattered his world like glass against stone. Sarah and the boy, little Sam. A fever had taken them in the space of a week, a cruel, silent thief that had stolen the air from his lungs and the color from his world. He had left everything behind after that. The farm in Ohio, the suffocating pity of neighbors, the very man he used to be. Here, in Wyoming, he was just Hale. A name, a shadow, a man who kept to himself. It was safer that way. The heart, he had discovered, could not break if it was never offered. His thoughts were interrupted by a sound, faint but sharp, that cut through the morning's peace. It was the whistle of the noon train, a shrill, lonely cry from the world beyond his valley. It was a sound he heard twice a week, a reminder of a life he had abandoned, but it rarely registered. Today, for reasons he could not name, it seemed to linger in the air, a dissonant note in the symphony of his solitude. It carried a sense of portent, a warning that the walls he had so carefully constructed were about to be tested. He scowled, dismissing the feeling as a trick of the wind, and turned to go back inside. The chores would not do themselves. The silence, he thought, was waiting. The town of Redemption Gulch was little more than a single dusty street carved out of the wilderness, a place that felt temporary, as if the vastness of the surrounding plains might one day swallow it whole. It consisted of a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith's forge, and the small train depot that served as its only tether to the civilized world. Caleb rode in every other week for supplies, a necessary evil he endured with stoic patience. He timed his visits to avoid the train's arrival, preferring the town in its usual state of drowsy quiet. But today his wagon had thrown a wheel, delaying him, and as he hitched his horse, tightened, to the rail outside the general store, the train was already hissing and groaning to a stop at the platform. He saw her the moment she stepped down from the passenger car. She was a stark slash of color and refinement against the dun-colored backdrop of the town. A traveling dress of deep blue wool, a hat adorned with a feather that drooped slightly from the journey, and honey blonde hair pinned in a neat chignon that seemed to defy the dust-filled air. She moved with a grace that was entirely out of place, her gloved hands clutching a small reticule as she scanned the sparse platform. Caleb felt an immediate, instinctual annoyance. She was the East personified, a place of soft hands and softer expectations, a world that had no currency here. He turned away, intending to ignore her, and began his list in his head. Flour, salt, coffee, cartridges. From the corner of his eye, he watched as the train pulled away, its whistle a mournful farewell, leaving her standing alone beside a large, formidable trunk. A few curious townspeople glanced her way before going about their business. Strangers were not an everyday occurrence, but this was a place where people learned not to ask too many questions. He saw the woman's shoulders, held so straight and hopeful a moment before, begin to slump. Her head turned from one end of the empty platform to the other, her initial optimism visibly dissolving into a quiet, dignified panic. Silas, the old station master with a face like a wrinkled apple, ambled out of his office. He approached her, his movements slow and cautious. Caleb could not hear their words, but he could read the story in their postures. Silas's concerned frown, the shake of his head, her hands, twisting the handle of her reticule. The man she was expecting, it seemed, was not there. Caleb loaded his sacks of flour and coffee into the wagon, his movements deliberate, methodical. It was not his concern. He had his own life to manage, a life predicated on the principle of non-interference. He had learned the hard way that other people's troubles were like quicksand. Yet he did not leave. He found himself lingering, adjusting the harness on Titan, rechecking the knot on the hitching rail. He told himself he was just waiting for Mr. Henderson to finish weighing his salt pork, but he knew it was a lie. He was watching the woman on the platform. He saw the moment her composure finally cracked. It was not a dramatic collapse, but a subtle tremor that ran through her, a slight bowing of her head as the full weight of her predicament settled upon her. She was alone, stranded in a place that could be brutally indifferent to the unprepared. "No one by the name of Blackwood lives in the valley, miss," Silas was saying, his voice carrying on the breeze, laced with pity. "Not for 10 years, anyway. Old Jedediah Blackwood sold his claim and moved on. Can't say I know anyone who's heard from him since." Caleb's jaw tightened. Blackwood. The name was a foul taste in his mouth. Jedediah Blackwood had been a hard, grasping man who had tried to dam up the creek upstream from Caleb's property years ago. A brief, ugly dispute had followed, ending only when Blackwood abruptly sold out and vanished. To hear his name now, connected to this woman, felt like a bad omen. With a sigh that was more of a curse, Caleb straightened up and walked toward the platform. His steps were heavy, reluctant. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, to ride back to the quiet of his valley and leave her to the charity of the town. But the image of her standing there, a solitary figure against the encroaching dusk, reminded him too keenly of another kind of abandonment. He stopped before her and Silas, his shadow falling over them. "Ma'am," he said. The word felt foreign on his tongue. She looked up, startled. Her eyes were the color of moss after a spring rain, wide and filled with a desperate hope that he immediately wanted to extinguish for her own good. Hope was a dangerous commodity in this land. "You have a problem," he stated. It was not a question. Before she could answer, Silas spoke. "Caleb, this is Miss Eleanora Ainsworth," she supplied, her voice softer than he expected, but clear. "I was to be met by my cousin, a Mr. Jedediah Blackwood. He offered me a position as governess for his children." Caleb's gaze was flat. "Blackwood has no children. And as Silas told you, he hasn't been here for years. You've been deceived, Miss Ainsworth." The bluntness of his words struck her like a physical blow. The last flicker of hope in her eyes died, replaced by a raw, unguarded vulnerability. She swayed slightly, and he saw Silas reach out a hand to steady her. The sight sent another unwelcome pang through him. He looked at her trunk, a heavy, leather-bound thing that spoke of a life hastily packed and left behind, a life that no longer existed. "There's a boarding house," Silas offered gently. "Mr. Henderson's wife runs it. It's clean." "I have very little money," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. The confession seemed to cost her what little pride she had left. Caleb's mind worked against his will, calculating, assessing. The boarding house was no place for a woman like her. It was filled with rough men, prospectors, and drifters. She would be safe enough, physically, but her spirit would be worn down to nothing in a week. He thought of his ranch, of the spare room, of Martha, his housekeeper, a stern but decent widow who came twice a week. It was a foolish, reckless idea. It was an invitation for complication to walk right through his front door. He looked away from her, toward the distant, purple mountains that guarded his valley. The sun was sinking, painting the clouds in fiery strokes of orange and red. In a few hours, the cold would descend. The world would become a place of shadows and predators. He could not leave her here. The ghost of the man he once was, the man who had protected a wife and son, would not allow it. "My housekeeper is at my ranch," he said, the words tasting like rust. "There's a spare room. You can stay there until you arrange for passage back east." He looked directly at her, his expression grim. "Martha will be there. It will be proper." Eleonora stared at him, her expression a mixture of shock, suspicion, and a desperate, burgeoning relief. She saw a tall, broad-shouldered man with a face that looked as if it had been carved from the granite of the surrounding hills. His eyes were the color of a stormy sky, and they held no softness, only a kind of weary, resolute duty. He was not offering kindness. He was stating a solution to a problem he clearly wished he had never encountered. I couldn't impose," she stammered, her Eastern manners warring with her dire circumstances. "It is not an imposition. It is a temporary solution," he corrected her, his tone leaving no room for argument. He bent down and, with an ease that surprised her, lifted the heavy trunk to his shoulder. As he straightened, the trunk shifted. He moved to steady it, and his other hand brushed her arm. For a brief, startling moment, she stumbled forward, her balance lost. He instinctively dropped his free hand to her waist to steady her, his grip firm and sure. The contact was like a bolt of lightning on a clear day. Through the fabric of her dress and his worn leather glove, a current of unexpected warmth passed between them. Her breath hitched. She was suddenly, intensely aware of him, the sheer physical presence of him, the scent of pine and clean sweat and leather, the strength in the hand that held her. For that fleeting second, the dusty train platform fell away, and there was only the circle of his arm, a bastion against the overwhelming fear that had been her companion for hours. Caleb felt it too, the unexpected softness of her, the way she fit against him for that brief instant. It was a feeling he had not experienced in 5 years, a ghost of an intimacy he had buried deep. He released her as if burned, stepping back abruptly. A dark flush crept up his neck. He cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on some distant point over her shoulder. "The wagon is this way," he said, his voice rougher than before. He turned and strode away without a backward glance. The heavy trunk settled on his shoulder as if it weighed nothing. Eleonora stood frozen for a moment, her hand pressed to her waist where his had been. The warmth lingered. Silas gave her a gentle, encouraging smile. "You go on, miss. Caleb Hale is a good man. A hard man, maybe, but a good one. You'll be safe with him." Gathering the tattered remnants of her composure, Eleonora nodded. She had no other choice. She followed the silent, forbidding man toward a sturdy wagon, toward an unknown future in a world that felt as alien as the surface of the moon. As she walked, she could not shake the feeling that she was stepping off one precipice and onto another, far more dangerous one. The fear of being stranded was being replaced by a new, more unsettling awareness of the man whose reluctant charity she had just accepted. The ride to the ranch was conducted in a taut silence, broken only by the creak of the wagon wheels and the soft thud of Titan's hooves on the dirt track. Eleonora sat ramrod straight on the hard wooden bench, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She stole glances at the man beside her. His profile was stark against the fading light, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. He had not spoken a single word since loading her trunk. The silence felt like a wall, and she had no idea how to breach it. She had come west chasing a lie, a carefully crafted fiction of a long-lost cousin in a respectable position. The letter, penned in a neat, scholarly hand, had been her only hope after her parents' death had left her penniless and alone in Boston. The inheritance had been swallowed by debts, and the society that had once welcomed her had turned a cold shoulder to an orphan woman with no dowry. The promise of a new life, of purpose, had been a siren's call she could not resist. Now, the song had ended, and she was dashed upon the rocks of reality. Why would someone do such a thing? She asked, her voice small in the vast emptiness. Why bring me all this way on a falsehood? Caleb's hands tightened on the reins. He had been asking himself the same question. A cruel prank seemed too simple. Bringing a woman like her out here required effort and expense. There was a purpose to it, a purpose he did not like. Some men find sport in the misery of others, he said, his voice a low rumble. Or they have reasons that are not immediately clear. He thought of Blackwood, of his grasping nature. This felt like the beginning of something, not the end. The landscape around them was both terrifying and beautiful. The plains rolled on into infinity, the grasses turning from gold to a deep purple in the twilight. The mountains loomed like sleeping giants, their peaks a jagged line against a sky awash with stars. It was a wild, untamed beauty, so different from the manicured parks and crowded streets of Boston. It made her feel profoundly small, a tiny, insignificant speck in a world of immense and ancient forces. She felt a shiver of fear, but beneath it, a strange, unexpected flicker of awe. It is vast, she said, more to herself than to him. He grunted in reply, a sound that could have meant anything. But he had heard the note of wonder in her voice, and it surprised him. Most Easterners he had encountered saw this land as something to be conquered or feared. They did not see the stark poetry of it. They finally turned into a valley, and she saw the dark shapes of a cabin and a barn huddled by a creek. A single light glowed in the cabin window, a welcoming beacon in the deepening dark. As they drew closer, the cabin door opened, spilling a rectangle of warm, yellow light onto the packed earth. A stout, gray-haired woman stood silhouetted in the doorway, wiping her hands on an apron. "That's Martha," Caleb said, his first voluntary words in over an hour. He pulled the wagon to a halt and jumped down. "Martha, we have a guest. She'll be staying in the spare room for a few days." Martha's sharp eyes took in Eleanor's fine but travel-worn dress, her pale, tired face, and her air of fragile dignity. Her gaze then shifted to Caleb, a question in their depths. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Martha, who had known Caleb since before the darkness had claimed him, understood. This was a rescue, not a romance. Her expression softened. "Well, get down, child, before you freeze," she said, her voice brisk but not unkind. "Supper's hot on the stove. You look like you could use a decent meal." Eleanora allowed Caleb to help her down from the wagon, careful to avoid a repeat of their earlier contact. The cabin was small but impeccably clean. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the smooth wooden walls. The air smelled of wood smoke, baking bread, and something else, the faint, lingering scent of lavender. A simple table was set for one. Martha quickly added a second plate. The meal was eaten in much the same silence as the wagon ride. The stew was rich and savory, the bread warm and crusty. Eleanora ate with a hunger that surprised her. It was the first real food she had tasted in days. She watched the two of them. Caleb ate with a grim efficiency, his focus entirely on his plate. Martha moved about the small space with a quiet competence, occasionally casting a watchful eye on Eleanora, her expression one of compassionate curiosity. "Your room is ready, dear," Martha said after the plates were cleared. "I put a hot brick in a bed for your feet." She led Eleanora to a small, spare room at the back of the cabin. It contained a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a small washstand, and a single window that looked out into the blackness. It was monastic, but it was clean and safe. "Thank you," Eleanora said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Thank you for your kindness." Martha patted her arm. There's no need for thanks. Life out here is hard enough without people turning their backs on one another. You get some rest. Things will look clearer in the morning. Left alone, Eleonora finally let the tears fall. They were tears of exhaustion, of fear, of humiliation for her own foolish hope. But they were also tears of a profound, aching relief. She had been adrift, and for tonight at least, she had found a safe harbor. As she drifted off to sleep under the heavy quilt, the last thing she remembered was the feeling of a strong hand on her waist, a brief, solid anchor in a world that had turned to shifting sand. Caleb sat by the fire long after the women had retired. The quiet of the cabin was different now. It was not the empty, resonant silence he was used to. It was a silence that was filled with the presence of another person, the soft sound of her breathing from the back room. It was an intrusion, a complication he had not wanted. He stared into the flames, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He had done the right thing, the only thing a decent man could do. But in doing so, he had allowed the outside world to breach his defenses. He had brought a stranger into the fortress he had built around his heart, and he could feel the foundations beginning to groan under the strain. He had a feeling that the silence he had so carefully cultivated would never sound the same again. The next few days fell into a strange, unspoken rhythm. Eleonora, mortified at the thought of accepting charity, was determined to earn her keep. She rose at dawn, surprising both Caleb and Martha, and insisted on helping with the chores. She learned to knead bread under Martha's patient tutelage, her soft hands, accustomed to needlepoint and piano keys, quickly becoming dusted with flour. She scrubbed the wooden floors, mended Caleb's shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, and learned to feed the chickens without flinching when they pecked at her skirts. Caleb watched her from a distance, a silent observer of this transformation. He had expected her to be a delicate, useless thing, a porcelain doll that would shatter in this harsh environment. He had expected complaints, tears, and a helpless dependence. He got none of it. Instead, he saw a quiet, steely determination. He saw resilience. He saw her face, which had been pale with exhaustion upon her arrival, gain a touch of color from the sun. He saw the way she would pause in her work to gaze out at the mountains, her expression not of fear, but of a kind of contemplative wonder. It was unsettling. She did not fit the neat, dismissive category in which he had placed her. He remained distant, his words clipped and practical. He would leave before dawn to work on the far pastures and return after dusk, covered in dust and smelling of horse and sweat. He took his meals with her and Martha, but he rarely spoke, offering only brief answers to direct questions. He was a mountain of a man, solid and unmovable, and yet she sensed a deep, abiding sadness in him, a sorrow as vast as the plains that surrounded them. She saw it in the rare moments he thought no one was watching, when his guard would slip and a look of profound loneliness would settle over his features. One evening, Martha was delayed in town, leaving Caleb and Eleonora alone for supper. The silence in the cabin was heavier than usual, thick with unspoken thoughts. Eleonora served the stew she had made herself, her heart thumping with a nervous anxiety. It felt like a test. He ate it without comment, but she noticed he cleaned his bowl. After the meal, they sat by the fire. The flames crackled and popped, the only sound in the room. She could feel his restlessness, his discomfort with this forced intimacy. She knew he wanted her gone, not out of malice, but out of a desperate need to return to his solitude. Yet she could not bring herself to resent him for it. She owed him her safety, perhaps even her life. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice soft but clear, "about what I will do. I cannot return to Boston. There is nothing for me there. I thought perhaps I could find work in town, as a teacher or a seamstress." Caleb stared into the fire, his hands resting on his knees. "This is no place for a woman alone, Miss Ainsworth. My name is Eleonora," she said gently, "and I have been alone for some time, Mr. Hale. My parents passed last winter. That is why I was so foolish as to believe my cousin's letter. I had no other prospects." He turned his head to look at her then, truly look at her for the first time. He saw not a helpless damsel, but a woman who had faced her own losses and was still standing. The revelation struck a chord of reluctant empathy within him. He knew what it was to have your world swept away. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, the words stiff and used. "An eye for yours," she replied quietly. He stiffened, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean by that?" "Martha told me," she confessed, her gaze unwavering. "About your wife and your son." She saw the pain flash in his eyes, raw and immediate, and her heart ached for him. "I'm not trying to pry. I only want you to know that I understand. Not the particulars of your grief, for every sorrow is unique, but the shape of it, the emptiness." The air in the cabin grew thick, charged with the weight of their shared histories of loss. He wanted to push her away, to retreat behind his wall of silence, to tell her she understood nothing. But her gaze was so direct, so full of a compassion that held no pity, that the words died in his throat. He found himself, against all his better judgment, wanting to speak of it, to give voice to the grief he had held silently for 5 long years. "Her name was Sarah," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "She had hair the color of corn silk and a laugh that could make wildflowers grow. We had a son, Samuel." He had his mother's smile. He spoke to the fire, as if he could not bear to look at Eleonora while he unearthed these sacred ghosts. "It was the fever, fast and merciless. I built this place to forget. But a man can't outrun his own heart." He fell silent, the confession hanging in the space between them. Eleonora did not move, did not speak. She simply sat with him in his sorrow, her quiet presence a balm. She did not offer empty platitudes or easy comforts. She offered him the rare gift of being seen, of having his pain acknowledged without judgment. In that moment, something shifted. A small, almost imperceptible crack appeared in the granite wall around his heart. He had shared his deepest wound with her, and the world had not ended. He did not feel weaker. He felt lighter. "My parents were good people," she said softly, filling the silence. "My father was a professor of literature. My mother loved to paint. Our house was always filled with books and music and laughter. When they were gone, the house became silent, and I discovered that silence can be the loudest sound in the world." He finally met her eyes across the flickering firelight. He saw his own experience reflected there. They were 2 solitary souls, adrift in a sea of loss, who had washed up on the same desolate shore. For the first time since she had arrived, he did not see her as an intrusion. He saw her as a fellow survivor. It was a bond he had not sought, a connection that terrified him, but one he could no longer deny. The silence that returned to the cabin that night was different. It was no longer a barrier. It was a shared space, a quiet understanding that bridged the distance between 2 lonely hearts. The fragile truce born of their shared vulnerability was shattered less than a week later. Caleb had ridden out to check on a section of fence bordering the lands that had once belonged to Jedediah Blackwood, now owned by a faceless conglomerate back east. The name Blackwood had been a burr under his saddle ever since Eleanor's arrival, a loose thread he couldn't stop pulling at. Her fraudulent summons was too elaborate for a simple prank. It was a move in a game he didn't yet understand. He found what he was half expecting, a long stretch of his fence cut, the wire snipped clean. His cattle, thankfully, had not wandered far, but the message was clear. It was a provocation, a test. As he was dismounting to begin the laborious task of mending the wire, he heard the crack of a rifle. The shot was not aimed at him. It was high, a splinter of bark exploding from a cottonwood tree a dozen feet above his head. A warning. Crouched behind Titan, Caleb scanned the low ridge overlooking the creek. He saw 2 riders, silhouetted against the morning sun. They were too far away to make out their faces, but their intent was unmistakable. They watched him for a long moment before turning their horses and melting back into the landscape. They were professionals, not common rustlers. Rustlers would have taken the cattle. These men were delivering a message. A cold fury settled in Caleb's gut. This was about more than just his land now. It was about her. Somehow, Eleonora was at the center of this. Blackwood, or whoever was pulling the strings, had brought her here as a piece on a chessboard, and now they were growing impatient. His first, overwhelming instinct was a fierce, primal surge of protectiveness. The thought of those men anywhere near her, near the sanctuary of his home, ignited a rage he had not felt in years. He worked quickly, his hands sure and steady as he spliced the wire, his mind racing. He had to get her away, send her to Cheyenne, or better yet, all the way back to Boston. The farther away she was from him and this valley, the safer she would be. The thought of her leaving, of the cabin returning to its empty silence, left a hollow ache in his chest that he angrily dismissed. Her safety was all that mattered. Attachments were a weakness, and his growing feelings for her, feelings he refused to name, were making her target. He rode back to the ranch with a grim resolve. He found her in the small garden she had started near the house, a patch of stubborn earth she was coaxing into life. Her sleeves were rolled up, her face smudged with dirt, and a few strands of honey blonde hair had escaped her braid to frame her face. She looked up and smiled when she saw him, a genuine, unguarded smile that struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was a smile that made him think of sunlight and new beginnings, things he had long since banished from his life. The sight of it only hardened his resolve. That smile, that innocence had to be protected, and he was the one endangering it. "Pack your things," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He dismounted and didn't look at her, busying himself with loosening Titan's cinch. Her smile faded, replaced by confusion. "What? Why? What has happened?" "You're leaving," he stated, pulling the saddle from the horse's back. "I'm taking you to town. The morning train heads east. You'll be on it." She followed him as he led the horse toward the barn, her steps quickening to keep up with his long strides. "Leaving? But I have nowhere to go. You can't just cast me out. I thought we had an understanding." He swung the heavy saddle onto its rack with a thud. He finally turned to face her, his expression a cold, impenetrable mask. He had to be cruel. It was the only way to make her go, the only way to ensure she didn't argue. It was a kindness disguised as brutality. The understanding was that this was temporary, he said, his voice like ice. "You have overstayed your welcome, Miss Ainsworth. This is my home, my life. I'll let you stay out of sense of duty, but my duty is done. It is time for you to go." Each word was a carefully chosen dagger, and he watched them find their mark. He saw the hurt blossom in her eyes, the shock, the betrayal. Her face paled, and she took a half step back as if he had struck her. Good, he thought, with a savage self-loathing. Let her hate him. Hate would keep her safe and far away. "I see," she whispered, her voice trembling. She wrapped her arms around herself, a small, defensive gesture. I did not realize I was such a burden." "The world is full of burdens," he said coldly, turning away from the pain on her face because he could not bear to see it. "It is time you learned to carry your own." He left her standing in the dusty barn, the scent of hay and horses thick in the air. He did not look back. He strode to the cabin, every step feeling like he was walking on broken glass. He felt like a villain, a monster, but it was necessary. To protect her, he had to drive her away. To save her from the danger he represented, he had to break her heart, and, in the process, he was shattering his own. Eleonora stood frozen in the barn, the coldness of his words seeping into her bones. A burden. The word echoed in the sudden, ringing silence. She had tried so hard to be useful, to not be an imposition. She had thought, after that night by the fire, that they had forged a connection, a quiet understanding between two wounded people. She had allowed herself to feel safe, to feel something akin to hope. She had looked at this hard, silent man and seen the goodness buried beneath the grief. She had started to imagine a life here, a life she could build with her own two hands. Now it was all gone, destroyed by a handful of callous words. She felt the familiar sting of tears, but refused to let them fall. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. Her chin came up, her spine stiffening. If he wanted her gone, she would go. She would not beg, would not plead. She had survived the loss of her parents and the destruction of her old life, She would survive this, too. She walked back to the cabin with a measured, dignified pace. She went to her room and began to pack her trunk, her movements precise and automatic. She folded her dresses, her hands shaking slightly. With each item she placed in the trunk, she was packing away the foolish, tender hopes she had allowed to bloom in this small cabin. She had been a fool to mistake his reluctant duty for something more. He was what he had always shown himself to be, a man who wanted only to be left alone. She had been a temporary disruption, and now he was restoring his precious order. The evening meal was an exercise in misery. Martha, who had returned and sensed the glacial tension in the air, tried to bridge the chasm with small talk, but her words fell into the silence and died. Caleb ate without looking up, his face a granite mask. Eleanor picked at her food, every bite tasting of ash. When it was over, she rose from the table. "Thank you, Martha, for the meal," she said, her voice steady despite the ache in her throat. "And thank you for all your kindness. I will not forget it." She looked at Caleb then, her green eyes clear and cold. "Mistad Hade, I will be ready to leave at your convenience in the morning." Without another word, she retired to her room and closed the door. The sound of the latch clicking into place was as final as a gunshot. Caleb sat at the table, the food heavy in his stomach. He had what he wanted. She was leaving. The complication would be removed. The danger would pass her by. So why did he feel as though he had just sawed off his own limb? "What did you do, Caleb?" Martha asked, her voice low and sharp. She stood across the table from him, her arms crossed, her eyes filled with a disappointment that was worse than any anger. "I did what was necessary," he said, his voice a low growl. "I'm keeping her safe. By breaking her heart? By treating her like a stray you've grown tired of feeding?" Martha shook her head, a deep sadness in her expression. "I knew your Sarah. She would be ashamed of you right now. You're letting fear rule you, son. You're so afraid of losing someone again that you're throwing away the first bit of happiness that's come your way in 5 years. You're a fool." Her words were a knife in his gut. He pushed back from the table, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You don't understand. There are men. There's trouble coming. She needs to be away from here. Away from me. Then you tell her that." Martha shot back. "You tell her the truth. You face the trouble together. Don't hide behind cruelty and call it protection. That's cowardice, Caleb Hale, and I never thought I'd say that about you." She turned and began to gather the dishes with angry, clattering movements. Caleb fled the cabin, escaping into the cold comfort of the night. He walked until he reached the creek, the sound of the rushing water a familiar lament. The moon was high and bright, casting the valley in shades of silver and black. He looked back at the cabin. Her window was dark. He imagined her in there, alone, hurt, packing away her life again because of him. Martha was right. He was a coward. He was so terrified of the past repeating itself, of watching someone he cared about be harmed, that he was choosing an empty life over a risky one. He was choosing the familiar pain of loneliness over the terrifying vulnerability of love. The night before Eleanor's departure was long and fraught with a tension that felt like a gathering storm. A heavy, oppressive silence had fallen over the cabin, a silence of grief and unspoken words. Caleb had spent the day preparing the wagon, his movements jerky and overly aggressive, as if he could work the turmoil out of his soul. Eleanor had remained in her room, emerging only for a brief, silent supper before retreating again. She was a ghost in his house, a painful reminder of the life he was willfully casting out. As darkness fell, a bitter wind kicked up, rattling the windows and moaning around the eaves of the cabin. It sounded like the world was weeping. Caleb sat by the fire, a rifle across his lap, ostensibly cleaning it, but really just needing the solid, cold weight of it in his hands. He was listening. Every gust of wind, every creak of the house, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He had seen fresh tracks down by the creek earlier, shod horses that did not belong to him. They were closing in. He prayed they would wait until she was gone, until she was safely on that train, heading east. Inside her room, Eleonora was not asleep. She sat on the edge of her bed, fully dressed, her packed trunk standing by the door like a tombstone. She had tried to read, but the words blurred. She had tried to pray, but her heart was too full of a cold, bitter anger. She was angry at Caleb for his cruelty, but she was angrier at herself for having been so foolish. She had let down her guard, had allowed herself to be vulnerable, and this was the price. The wind howled outside, a perfect mirror of the tempest in her soul. The first sound that was out of place was the soft nicker of a horse from the barn. It was not Titan's familiar call. It was a nervous, questioning sound. Caleb froze, his head snapping up, his hand tightening on the rifle. He rose silently from his chair and moved to the window, peering through a small gap in the curtains. In the pale, windswept moonlight, he saw them. 3 figures, moving low and fast from the direction of the barn toward the house. They were shadows, wraiths armed with rifles, their intent as black as the night. His blood ran cold. They hadn't waited. They were here now, and she was still inside. He moved with a deadly quiet, his years of solitude and self-reliance taking over. He crossed to Martha's room and shook her awake. "Get dressed. Stay low and away from the windows," he whispered urgently. He then moved to Eleonora's door and knocked softly. "Eleonora, get up. We have trouble." She opened the door instantly, her eyes wide in the dim light. She was already dressed, her face pale but composed. Fear was there, but also a surprising lack of panic. "What is it?" "Men. Outside. They mean to do us harm," he said, his voice a low, hard whisper. "Stay behind me." A floorboard creaked on the front porch. A splintering crash followed as the cabin door was kicked in, shattering the lock. The first man burst through the opening, a bulky silhouette against the moonlight. Caleb was ready. The rifle in his hands came up and fired, the explosion deafening in the confined space. The man grunted and collapsed, a dark shape on the floor. "Get back," Caleb yelled, shoving Eleonora and Martha toward the back of the cabin, toward the relative safety of the kitchen. Another shot rang out from outside, shattering the window near the hearth. Glass sprayed across the room. The fight was a chaotic blur of noise and motion. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness, followed by the roar of gunfire and the thud of bullets tearing through the wooden walls. Caleb used the heavy furniture as cover, firing methodically, making every shot count. He was a man transformed, no longer the quiet, solitary rancher, but a grim, efficient fighter protecting his home, protecting his own. Eleonora, huddled with Martha behind the thick oak table in the kitchen, refused to be a passive victim. Her initial terror was being burned away by a hot, fierce anger. These men were trying to kill the man who, for all his recent cruelty, had saved her. They were destroying this small sanctuary that had been her home. She looked around desperately, her eyes falling on Caleb's spare rifle, propped in the corner. "I can load," she said to Martha, her voice tight but steady. She had seen her father and his friends shoot skeet. She knew the basic mechanics of a firearm. "Caleb," she called out. He glanced back, his face grim in the flickering lamplight. He saw the rifle in her hands, her determined expression. A flash of something, astonishment, pride, fear for her, crossed his face. He fired his last shot, then scrambled back to her position as another volley of bullets peppered the front of the cabin. "Slide it to me," he commanded. She pushed the loaded rifle across the floorboards. He grabbed it, handed her his empty one, and was back in position in an instant. "Stay down." They worked as a team. She became his arsenal, her fear channeled into the focused, repetitive task of loading, her movements becoming faster, more certain with each repetition. She was no longer the refined lady for Boston. She was a woman of the frontier, fighting for her life, for their lives. She caught a glimpse of one of the attackers moving past the side window, a fleeting shadow. On pure instinct, she grabbed the heavy iron skillet from a stove and hurled it at the window. The glass shattered with a loud crash. The man outside yelled in surprise, his shot going wild. The diversion gave Caleb the split second he needed. He fired, and the shadow fell. Only one remained. The silence that fell was more terrifying than the noise. The wind still howled, but the gunfire had stopped. Caleb was breathing heavily, his eyes scanning the broken doorway, the shattered windows. Where was the third man? The attack came from behind. The man had circled around and broken in through the back door, which led into the storeroom. He burst into the kitchen, a huge, bearded man with a wild look in his eyes, a long knife in his hand. He lunged not at Caleb, but at Eleonora. There was no time to think. Caleb roared, a primal sound of fury and terror, and threw himself at the attacker. He dropped his rifle and met the man head-on, his only thought to put his body between the blade and Eleonora. They crashed to the floor, a tangle of limbs and grunts of effort. The knife clattered away, skittering across the floorboards. Eleonora screamed, a sound of pure fear, but then her training, her very nature, took over. She would not stand by. She grabbed the heaviest thing she could find, a thick piece of firewood from the box by the stove. As the two men grappled on the floor, the attacker, straining to reach his knife, she brought the log down with all her might on the back of his head. There was a sickening thud, and the man went limp beneath Caleb. Silence, absolute and profound. The only sound were the ragged gasps of their breathing and the lonely cry of the wind. Caleb pushed the unconscious man off him and scrambled to his feet. He turned to Eleonora. She stood over them, the piece of firewood still clutched in her hands, her knuckles white. Her chest was heaving, her eyes wide with shock and adrenaline. He crossed the space between them in 2 strides and pulled her into his arms. He held her tight, his face buried in her hair, breathing in her scent. He was shaking, not from the fight, but from the terrifying, soul-shattering fear of almost losing her. The thought of that knife, of what could have happened, was a physical agony. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice hoarse, broken. "Eleonora, I am so sorry. I was a fool. A damn fool." She clung to him, her body trembling, the strength that had sustained her through the fight finally deserting her. She buried her face against his chest, her tears finally coming, hot and cleansing. "I thought you wanted me to leave," she sobbed. "Never," he said, his voice thick with emotion. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. The firelight danced in her eyes, reflecting her fear and her courage. In that moment, he saw all of her, the refined lady, the determined survivor, the fierce protector. And he knew, with a certainty that shook him to his core, that he could not live without her. The walls around his heart did not just crack, they crumbled into dust. "I love you," he said, the words torn from the deepest part of his soul. "I was pushing you away to protect you, but I was wrong. The only thing I was protecting was my own fear. Don't leave, Eleonora. Please don't leave. Stay. Stay and build a life with me." Her tears stopped. She stared at him, searching his stormy gray eyes, and saw the truth there, raw and undeniable. She saw the love, the fear, the regret. All the coldness was gone, replaced by a desperate, beautiful vulnerability. Her own heart, which she thought had been broken, answered with a fierce, soaring hope. "Oh, Caleb," she whispered, a tremulous smile touching her lips. "There is nowhere else I would rather be." He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation and relief, of promises made in the crucible of violence. It was a kiss that sealed the end of his loneliness and the beginning of her true home. In the wreckage of the cabin, surrounded by the evidence of the battle they had just survived, they found their peace, their future, their beginning. In the gray light of dawn, the aftermath of the night's violence was stark and brutal. Sheriff Brody and 2 of his deputies arrived from town, summoned by Martha, who had slipped out during the fight's final, chaotic moments. They surveyed the scene with grim professionalism. The 2 bodies outside, the unconscious third man, now tied securely to a chair, and the bullet-riddled cabin. Caleb stood with the sheriff by the porch, explaining the events in a low, steady voice. He left out no detail, including his suspicion that Jedediah Blackwood, or someone acting on his behalf, was behind the entire affair, starting with Eleonora's fraudulent summons. The third man, now conscious and thoroughly intimidated, had confirmed it. Blackwood had never left the territory. He had simply moved to Cheyenne, amassing wealth and power, and had always coveted Caleb's land for its steady supply of water, the lifeblood of any cattle empire. Eleonora was meant to be a pawn, a way to manufacture a scandal or a debt to gain leverage. When that had failed, he had resorted to violence. "He won't get away with this," Sheriff Brody said, his jaw tight with anger. "We'll take this one back to town, and I'll send a wire to the marshal in Cheyenne." Blackwood's days of hiding in plain sight are over. Eleonora watched them from the doorway. She had spent the early morning hours with Martha, cleaning what could be cleaned, sweeping up broken glass, and trying to bring a sense of order back to the violated space. Her body ached, and her nerves were frayed, but a deep, quiet calm had settled in her heart. She was no longer adrift. She looked at Caleb, standing tall and resolute in the morning light, and felt a sense of belonging so profound it almost brought her tears. This was her home. He was her home. After the sheriff and his men had departed with their prisoner, a heavy silence fell over the ranch. The damage was extensive. The front door was splintered, windows were shattered, and the walls were pocked with bullet holes. It was a wreck. "It can all be fixed," Caleb said, coming to stand beside her. He followed her gaze, seeing the destruction through her eyes. "The door can be replaced. New glass can be brought in from Cheyenne. The walls will have scars. Just like us." He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers lacing through hers. It was a simple gesture, but it was filled with a world of meaning. It was a promise, a commitment. "Eleonora," he said, his voice soft, hesitant. He was a man more comfortable with actions than words, and this was new territory for him. He reached into the small pocket of his waistcoat and pulled out a simple, delicate gold ring, a single small pearl set in its center. "This was my grandmother's. She gave it to my mother, who gave it to Sarah." He paused, and her heart stilled. She saw the conflict in his eyes, the fear that she would see this as an attempt to replace the woman he had lost. "It is not a symbol of the past," he continued, his gaze earnest and direct. "I want it to be a symbol of our future. Sarah is a part of my story, a part of who I am, just as your parents are a part of you. But you are my future, Eleonora. If you'll have me, I want to build a new life with you, right here. I want to fix this house and fill it with laughter. I want to watch your garden grow. I want to have children with you and watch them run by the creek." He took a deep breath. "Marry me, Eleonora Ainsworth. Marry me and make this lonely place a home again." Tears welled in her eyes, but these were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of a joy so pure and overwhelming it filled every part of her. She thought of her arrival, a frightened, lonely woman with nothing but a false promise. And now she stood here, being offered everything she had ever dreamed of: a home, a purpose, a partner, a love that was as strong and resilient as the land itself. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Caleb Hale, I will marry you." A slow smile spread across his face, a genuine, soul-deep smile that transformed his harsh features and made her heart soar. It was like watching the sun break through after a long, dark storm. He slid the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. Word of the attack and Caleb's and Eleonora's impending marriage spread through Redemption Gulch like a prairie fire. The initial gossip and suspicion about the Eastern woman living at the Hale Ranch were burned away, replaced by a fierce, communal pride and support. These were their people, and they had been threatened. The town rallied. Mr. Henderson, the store owner, organized a group of men who rode out to the ranch with lumber and tools. They spent a weekend repairing the cabin, their hammers ringing out in a cheerful chorus of community. The women of the town, led by Martha and Mr. Henderson's wife, arrived with baskets of food, quilts, and jars of preserves. They fussed over Eleonora, welcoming her into their fold not as a stranger, but as one of their own. She, who had felt so alone in the world, was suddenly surrounded by a community, a family forged in the harsh realities of frontier life. The wedding was a simple affair, held 2 weeks later on the newly repaired porch of the cabin. officiated by a traveling preacher. The entire town seemed to be in attendance. Eleonora wore a simple cream-colored dress she and Martha had sewn, and in her hair she wore a crown of the small, stubborn wildflowers she had picked from the banks of the creek. Caleb stood beside her, looking slightly uncomfortable in a borrowed suit coat, but his eyes never left her face. When they spoke their vows, their voices were clear and strong, a testament to the storms they had weathered and the future they were ready to build together. 2 years later, the valley was bathed in the soft, golden light of a late afternoon in September. The cottonwood trees along the creek were beginning to turn, their leaves a brilliant yellow against the deep blue sky. The ranch was no longer a place of stark solitude. It was a place of life, of growth. The small cabin now had a new wing, built with sturdy pine and filled with light. The garden Eleonora had started was thriving, overflowing with late-season vegetables and herbs. The cattle herd had grown, and a new, larger barn stood proudly beside the old one. The scars on the cabin walls were still there, but they were covered now by climbing roses that Eleonora had planted, their deep red blossoms a symbol of a beauty that could grow from old wounds. Eleonora sat on a blanket spread in the grass near the creek, a book open in her lap, though she was not reading. She was watching her husband and her son. Caleb was teaching little Samuel, a sturdy toddler with his father's gray eyes and his mother's honey-colored curls, how to skip stones on the water. Caleb's movements were slow, patient, his large, calloused hand gently guiding the boy's smaller one. The sound of their laughter, Caleb's a low, rumbling chuckle, and Sam's a high-pitched shriek of delight, drifted on the warm air. A deep sense of peace and contentment settled over Eleonora, a feeling so profound it felt like a prayer. The memory of her arrival, of the fear and uncertainty, seemed like a story from another lifetime, about another woman. The frontier had not broken her. It had forged her. It had stripped away the non-essential and revealed a strength she never knew she possessed. And it had given her this, a love as vast and enduring as the mountains that watched over their valley. Caleb looked up and saw her watching them, a gentle smile on her face. He left Sam happily splashing at the water's edge and walked over to her, his long strides eating up the distance. He sat down beside her on the blanket and stretched out, resting his head in her lap. She closed her book and ran her fingers through his dark hair. "He has your determination," she said softly, nodding toward their son. He tried for nearly an hour to move that large rock by the water's edge. He refused to give up. Caleb chuckled, his eyes closing in contentment. "He has your smile and your courage." He opened his eyes and looked up at her, his gaze full of a love that still, after 2 years of marriage, had the power to take her breath away. "I was thinking today," he said, his voice quiet, "about the first time I saw you, standing on that train platform. You looked so out of place, like a songbird in a field of crows." "I was terrified," she admitted. "I felt as though the world had opened up and swallowed me whole." "And now?" he asked. She looked around her, at the peaceful valley, at the sturdy home they had built, at the child who was the embodiment of their love. She looked down at the man, lying with his head in her lap, a man who had faced his own ghost to build a future with her. The silence that surrounded them was no longer a language of loneliness. It was a language of love, of shared history, of a peace hard-won and deeply cherished. "Now," she said, her voice filled with a quiet, certain joy, "I know that it wasn't swallowing me. It was leading me home.